It is that time of year. The books are read, the ratings are in, and the numbers have been crunched. It is now time to announce the 2021 Book of the Year Awards. Hey everyone, how are you doing today? As I introduced so weirdly, today is the day where I will be announcing my various categories and giving out my book awards, and then finishing off with a showdown between my favourite books. I know a lot of you have enjoyed my showdown spread in my 2022 journal setup, which I will link above. And so I figured we'd do my actual showdown here to then reveal the book of the year. So without any further ado, let's just get straight into our categories. I have different sections. So the first kind of section is more, well, there's one's just about my reviews. We then have the actual genres of books. So there'll be like best contemporary, best fantasy, best this, best that, yada, yada, yada. Then I will be looking at the actual like best of books, so like the best fairy loot, the best book cover, my best author, the best debut, and then finally we will have the showdown where I will pair two books from various months, and then eventually we will narrow it down until just one book remains. And I'm going to start with, I stole this idea off of Clumsy Charlotte. Her book award video was freaking hilarious, and one of the categories that she did was her rantiest review. And so I had a look through my reviews and I had very few that were quite salty, but then I came across two. Both of these ended up being DNFs. One of them I am going to do as an honourable mention. My second review, however, did have a lot more salt sprinkled in amongst the critique. And so I'm going to show the honourable mention because there was one part of this review in particular that I was like, oh my god, I actually wrote that. This was for The Charmed Wife by Olga Grushin that I gave 1 star and I DNF'd at 30%. I said, what this book enticed and what this book delivered felt like two completely different paradigms. Like being told there is a pie waiting for you, yet when you bite into it expecting to find apple, you instead get chicken. I don't know why I wrote that, but clearly I was salty and that day maybe I hadn't been given pie. But my actual rantiest slash saltiest review of the year, Hook and Crown by Nicole Knapp. I will try to read this quite quickly because it was a bit lengthy and there were too many bits that I felt I needed to say. So I was drawn to the premise of this as there are very few Peter Pan retellings and it is a story I love, especially one that hints at a darker Peter. Unfortunately, the blurb was about the only thing I ended up enjoying, and for the first time in my life I DNF'd the book at 85%. Yes, you read that right. I got to 85% and then gave up because I could just not do this anymore. I rolled my eyes multiple times at the cheesy writing and how superficial Elena is as a character. She keeps asking questions that as someone who claims to love Peter Pan, she should know the answer to, such as asking who it is when they are attacked, even after she'd seen the Jolly Roger and knows there's pirates, yet she doesn't know who Captain Hook is? Really? I've never hated a main character more, and spent at least half of the book scoffing or rolling my eyes. For a girl who goes on so strongly about not needing a man and being so independent, she falls almost immediately for every male that flutters his eyelashes towards her for a nanosecond. She was so weak, the only word I could think of to describe her is floozy. Her only personality trait, claimed multiple times in the book, was that she is a gorgeous girl. Other than that, I only found her to be superficial and vapid. Pace and plot was a major issue. There were many times where we were told the exact same sequence of events written from each of the characters' perspectives. It grew so tedious, especially in the final chapters, where I found myself growing frustrated by the repetition. I would have preferred it to be in one perspective, with the alternate perspectives being used more for inner thoughts and events rather than a play-by-play of what we'd just read twice. Finally, I hit the breaking point. What felt like the climax of the book and the end of the villain happened, and I thought we would have 1, maybe 2 more chapters till the end. No, there are another 7 chapters and over an hour of the narration left. That's almost a third of the bloody book. The big bad was gone, therefore the book should be wrapping up, surely? But no, we end the book with the long, drawn-out aftermath of the battle that went on far too long, and it got to the point I just didn't care anymore about the outcome. This pacing gave me issues, as with the audiobook too. In the book, this was 7 hours long. In reality, it felt like 50 hours had passed. I had other issues with the audio too. At first I liked the narration, but by the end I really couldn't wait for it to finish. I'm still not sure if Will and Aidan were meant to have Irish or Scottish accents, but what happened is the voice actress failed to create an accent that was either. Overall, I give this book kudos for having a twist on Peter Pan and the idea of nothing being what it seems, but with barely an inclusion of many things that make Neverland what it is, characters I couldn't care about, and a plot that was repetitive and lacklustre, I can safely say it was not an experience I particularly enjoyed or would recommend to inflict on any other human. I was salty about that book, and I stand by everything that I wrote. Moving on to the actual awards now. The first category that we have is the genres, and we are beginning this with the best contemporary, and for that I have chosen One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. This book had sapphic romance, it had funny characters, it had a great cast, and is the first time that I have read or seen something with time travel that didn't confuse the hell out of me and make me want to cry. So that was good. Next up is the best graphic novel or manga, and for this I have chosen A Man and His Cat Volume 1 by Umi Sakurai. This was super emotional, extremely cute, featured a cat as a main character, and gave us the perspective from both the cat and the owner as they both navigate their new lives together, and was just so beautiful. Our next and final of the genre categories goes to fantasy, and for this I have separated into two subcategories. We have YA and adult. This is because fantasy is still my most read genre, and so it was very difficult to try and pick one, and I thought both YA and adult had very different calibre of books, and so I wanted to look at both. So we're going to start with the YA category, and the best YA fantasy of 2021 for me was Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. Is anybody surprised? I don't think so. It had a brilliant romance, it had amazing characters, it introduced me to elements of a culture I didn't know very much about, and it had one of the best sort of wrap-ups and climaxes I think I've ever read in a standalone fantasy, and it was brilliant. I just cannot commend this enough. It's so good, and I also listened to this on the audiobook, which I will also 10 out of 10 recommend. And then for our fantasy adult book, again, I don't think anybody is going to be surprised, House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. It might have been a bit of a slow build, but it was a fantastic build, it had great characters, it had a fantastic ending, it played with my emotions, and it took me on one of the best rides that I've been on. And I wasn't expecting to. I expected to not enjoy this book. I did not expect to absolutely adore this book and then grant it the fantasy adult category. So, well done. We're now moving on to the actual, the book aesthetics and authors and slightly more nitty-gritty. And we are starting with the funniest book. There were a couple of books that did make me absolutely howl with laughter. However, there was one book that immediately came to mind, and I could not think of any other book that made me laugh quite as much as this one. The Extraordinaries by TJ Klune. Everything about this book had me laughing, from the absolute insanity that is Nick to how ridiculous the fan fiction was within it. Nick's dad for me was just excellent, and just so much about this book had me laughing. So this one was definitely the funniest of all the books. We then have the book that gave me the most feels. Again, this one was very difficult. There was a toss-up between two, and the runner-up for this one was The Authenticity Project by Claire Pooley, but the winner is one that I've already talked about in this book, in this awards ceremony, and that is A Man and His Cat by Umi Sakurai. I cried so much throughout this, both happy and emotional tears, because just the thoughts and the feelings and the things that even happen between the cat and the man just was so beautiful. And yes, it did make me cry quite a lot. So that one goes as my most emotional book. Next up, we have the most unique book, which again is one that I took from Clumsy Charlotte. For this one, I am going with Pet by Akwe Kamezi. It's a very unique book because it's kind of dystopia and it's kind of very thought-provoking, but also it was extremely short. But the concept of these monsters and angels and just the whole book was very different to anything else that I read this year. Even the cover is just very unique and stands out, and yes, this was just such an interesting book to read and it stuck with me. We then have the most beautiful cover of any book, and this one was so hard because there are some beautiful books that have been on my list this year, but the one that I definitely think is my favourite, that is Namesake by Adrienne Young. And it's the second book in the Fable series, and I just think this cover is so stunning. It's just the colours and the art style and just like the details in her eye. Everything about this cover is gorgeous. Even the font is gorgeous. Everything. I absolutely adored it. The next category is one that I came up with all by myself, and that is the best fairy loot. I did manage to read a few this year, and I feel like it deserves its own category because they're part of like my book group, and it's kind of like the only sort of book club type thing that I take part in every year. The winner for this category is These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. This is the book that has made me rethink how I feel about fae books, and it had a incredible plot, it had intrigue, it had mystery. I am invested in every single character in this book. Everything about it was great. It's the prettiest I think that we've had this year, with this kind of like autumnal colour scheme, the sprayed edges, and we even have like artwork under the dust jacket, and I just feel that this book was everything that I could want in like a dark kind of YA, almost adult. I'd say this was on the very cusp, but definitely my pick for Fairy Loot Book of the Year. Next up, I have the best character. This one was so hard, and I kind of hated myself for doing this, but I think I shortlisted it to about 10. And then I got it down to 5, and then I just stopped and I just went, right, of these 5, who comes to mind first? And that was Nick from The Extraordinaries. I loved this character. I connected to him. I was Nick at 16. And even though it ends up not quite being what we thought it was, he also gets really bad migraines, which again is something that I get. So, you know, it just, I don't know, I loved this character. I loved his story. I loved his way of thinking. Like, I wanted to slap him a couple of times as well, but then again, I want to slap myself half the time. So Nick from The Extraordinaries was the best character of all. We then have the best romance of the year and the best couple. There was one couple who completely blew me away, and whose story is not yet over, and I cannot wait to find out. And that couple is Oren and Rit from the Plated Prisoner series. I can't say too much because there are some spoilers in there, but what I can say is they start off as she's a captive, he is her captor, and yet just, they are like the ultimate couple. And just, they bring out the best in each other, they support each other, they encourage each other, and I adore them so much. And they had some of the steamiest scenes I've ever read in any book ever, as well as having this amazing relationship develop, and it felt real and I loved it. Then we have the best series of the year. And there were a few series, and for this category I went by series that I had completed this year because then I can assess the full series. The best series goes to The Brown Sisters by Talia Hibbert. The only book that I had less than amazing feelings for was the second book, Take a Hint, Danny Brown. But all of the books were brilliant. All of the books were funny. They all had realistic relationships. They all had realistic characters. And they were all really well done for the build-up. Danny I didn't like very much. I just wasn't as invested. I didn't like her character very much. Zaf kind of bored me a little bit. But the other two, Chloe and Eve, were spectacularly done and I loved them. So overall, that was the best series that I read this year and would recommend to anybody. We then have the best standalone, and I've already mentioned a couple of times, but that book, I could not resist. It had to be done. I have tried to not use the same book multiple times in this list, but alas, unfortunately, it has happened. But the best standalone was Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, for the reasons I already explained in this video. It was perfect. I loved it. 5 stars. Next is the best debut of 2021, and for that I've chosen The Conductors by Nicole Glover. This had a very unique take on magic. It was all based around star signs and astrology, and it kind of incorporated historical fiction with a little bit of fantasy, which normally I don't enjoy, but this was really, really well done. It had characters who are married for convenience, but then start to realise they might actually love each other. And it also had a bit of a murder mystery in there. And all of these elements combined to create a very intriguing, well-written and very beautifully done book. And of all the debuts that I read this year, which admittedly I only read about 6, but it stood out and was the only one that I could think of when I was trying to think for this list. So that is my award for best debut. And then the final category before the showdown begins is the best 2021 release. So this also obviously will include like the debuts and stuff like that, but it did go to my favourite author, Nalini Singh, with Archangel's Light. I've been waiting for 10 years for this particular book in the series, and it's a couple that I have been desperate for. It's my absolute favourite characters in the whole series. So of course there is no way that this book was not going to end up being my favourite release of 2021. You're going to find out soon if it became my book of the year. Okay, the moment has arrived. The book showdown. Who is going to remain victorious? There are 12 books. I didn't count, but there are a number of showdowns that are going to take place. These have all been randomised when it came to picking them in the showdown, because I didn't want it to just be January and February, March, April. I wanted it to be randomised. So first of all, we have October facing off against March. So we have Archangel's Light by Nalini Singh versus Guy Corella by Ashley Poston. Unfortunately, Nalini wins. Ashley Poston is out. Ooh, that was a bit violent. Next we have July with One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston versus November with The Authenticity Project by Claire Pooley. Alas, as much as it was great, Claire Pooley is out, leaving One Last Stop the winner. Next up, we have May with Get a Life, Chloe Brown, going up against August with The Extraordinaries by TJ Klune. Unfortunately, Chloe, you just weren't good enough. The Extraordinaries takes the biscuit. Next, by complete chance, we ended up with January versus December. So, the first and last books of the year, we have House of Earth and Blood from Sarah J. Maas from January, going up against A Man and His Cat, Volume 1 by Umi Sakurai. As much as I adored A Man and His Cat, House of Earth and Blood is the one that takes the victory. We then have April versus September. So for April, we have Caressed by Ice by Nalini Singh. And for September, we have Gleam by Raven Kennedy, which is book 3 in the Plated Prisoner series. I'm so sorry, Nalini, it pains me to do this, but you are out. The winner goes to Gleam. Finally, February versus June, where we have a newcomer to my roster, which is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, versus my all-time favourite retelling and my second reread of Alice by Christina Henry. I'm sorry, Alice, I love you. You are my all-time favourite dark fantasy, but you have been eliminated and it goes to Cemetery Boys. Round 2, let's go. We have Archangel's Light by Nalini Singh versus One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. You did well reaching round 2, but Nalini remains the queen. Archangel's Light takes the winner and One Last Stop has gone. Second, we have The Extraordinaries by TJ Klune versus House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This one is so hard, so difficult, and nearly broke my brain trying to decide. But in the end, I'm sorry. You were amazing. I love you, Nick, so much. But Bryce wins. Finally, with this round, we have Gleam versus Cemetery Boys. And unfortunately, there is no contest. Cemetery Boys takes the victory. Round 3, we have 3 books. And I probably could have done this a little bit smarter, but I ended up just basically picking between each of them to eventually come up with 2. We had Archangel's Light going up against House of Earth and Blood. And as much as I adore Nalini, House of Earth and Blood just took that victory. And then when I did the same again and we had Cemetery Boys versus Archangel's Light, again, it hurt my heart. Nalini, you are a goddess. I love you. You're my favourite author and my favourite release of 2021. But you are now out. The winner goes to Cemetery Boys, which means our final goes between Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas and House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This decision probably is not a surprise to anybody. Is anybody surprised? Is anyone going to comment and say that they didn't think that I was going to choose between these 2 books? Pause it now. Comment below what you think I'm going to choose. Tick, 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 tick. Okay, so, oh my god, this nearly killed me. I actually was in tears trying to decide. But unfortunately, as I wrote in my very first review of the year, I said, I am calling it now, but this book is going to be Book of the Year. I love you. You are so gorgeous. I've recommended you to everyone. But Cemetery Boys loses. And the winner for Book of the Year 2021 goes to House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. I called it. It was the very first book I read in 2021. I called it at the time that I thought it was going to be Book of the Year. I re-listened to it at the end of the year and it destroyed me and reinforced that yes, this book was perfection for me. So my 2021 Book of the Year goes to Crescent City, House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. Let's give all of our contenders a round of applause. All of our authors that we read in 2021, a massive thank you. We thank you all. You brought us love, you brought us joy, you brought us tears, you brought us hate, and most of all, you brought us a whole new set of words that we would never have had if you hadn't sat to write. We thank you all. I thank you all. The awards have been finished. They've all been given out. There is nothing left for me to say except I hope you are good. I hope you're staying safe. Comment below what your Book of the Year was, and I will see you on the next video. Goodbye.